make the custom music.
You want to bullshit for a minute? Okay. Kyle likes the music. He has good tastes.
Yeah, it's like custom, right? It's like for you guys alone.
DJ Danarchy. He's a genius.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That guy's so good. I used to play, like, we used to do, like, Dipset interstitials, but then...
Copyright.
Yeah, because YouTube wants to promote its own music service. Fucking assholes.
Yeah, that gets in the way for sure, copyright stuff.
What kind of music would you play if you could?
What's that? What would I play? I have similar as you, like non-copyrighted stuff.
Nice. Okay, I guess we're ready to go.
Sweet.
All right. Welcome, everybody. This is a joint Secular Talk Michael Brooks show. Joining us is, he's been crushing it for years on YouTube. I'm sure you know who he is. If for some reason you don't, Kyle Kulinski, host of Secular Talk, one of the founding members of Justice Democrats. Kyle, thanks for doing this, man. This is fun. How you doing?
Thanks so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it. I was just telling you before we came on air how much I loved your talk with Professor Wolf. I was watching that the other night, and he regularly blows my mind. And you have had some wonderful guests and have done some wonderful shows. So keep it up. I really like what you're doing.
Oh, man. Much appreciated. So basically, we're going to have like probably one of the only sort of like civil conversations, agreements, disagreement that you will find on YouTube. Mostly on YouTube, it's sort of useless to do that. Better to dunk on people. But I think this will be really good. And it's about, I guess... We started chatting with each other. We've followed each other on Twitter and stuff for a while, but we had a little bit of, I guess, a disagreement about basically how to interpret the Andrew Gillum loss, if I recall correctly. I think our views are actually closer than people might think, but I guess before we get there, what were you sort of thinking about Andrew Gillum, and where do you want to situate yourself in the conversation about progressive politics, economics, identity, and the future of the Democratic Party?
Yeah, so we could go in a number of directions with that broad question, and honestly, you and I could probably talk about that for like 5 hours straight.
Indeed.
But I'll try to start with the Gillum part, because that was probably the crux of our disagreement. And again, I think you're actually correct that when we nail it down, there's not nearly as much disagreement as we think there is. I think it's just a matter of where we put the onus in the conversation. So my initial reaction, and I admit that this was bad timing because people were reeling from the loss, what we thought was a loss at the time, but then it obviously dragged on. But I had said something along the lines of, it's a shame that he didn't double down on the primary strategy, and he campaigned with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Hillary Clinton, and he rather prominently stopped talking about Medicare for all. And then there was another instance of him tweeting a few times about how we need to get tough on Venezuela, which kind of made a bunch of lefties, their eyes roll back in their head and go, oh, what is he doing? And, from my perception of it, it looked like he and his campaign made an active decision to do the standard Democratic textbook strategy of, okay, now we're in the general election. Now it's time to pivot and get serious. Now it's time to sound more moderate to reach out to these middle ground voters that we're going to need to win. And basically, what I was trying to get at there, admittedly in a clunky way because I pissed off plenty of people with my tweets, is I think that if he did double down on that, the primary strategy, that there's a decent chance he would have been able to take the election. And what I want to make clear, though, is what I was not saying, which some people interpreted me as saying. I wasn't, by any stretch of the imagination, trying to downplay the impact of what I call the TFGs, which stands for Too Far Gones, which is basically the people who, under no circumstance, would have voted for Gillum. Like, that's not, I wasn't trying to say that, like, oh my God, if he doubled down on Medicare for all, he would have gotten this person who's borderline in the Klan to vote for him.
Right.
So to me, it's just a matter of where we put the onus, because I think that there are plenty of TFGs out there that you're just not going to reach. But I think the substantive disagreement that I have with many people on the left is what exactly do we do about it? And what I say is get the people who are gettable. And what that means is doubling down on the primary strategy, super serving the Democratic base. But also on top of that, in the process of doing that, you actually pick off many more independents and many more non-voters because our ideas, our leftist ideas, are actually more popular than people on the left typically give them credit for.
Yeah, so I mean, again, this anticlimactic. I agree with most of what you're saying, and I think it's just a question of teasing apart some important distinctions here. And I'll start small and move to bigger, more important points. So the small point is things like the Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the trash that he said about Venezuela and Cuba. And I think this is a really delicate balance because there's a lot of people who come at this, I think, in new media platforms and on the left, people like us, frankly, who are, they're sick of the bullshit. They're sick of lies. They're sick of spin. They're sick of positioning. And they're certainly, more serious and substantively, sick of interventionism and imperial U.S. foreign policy and, corporate subservient Democrats, right? There's no doubt about that. But I also think that what gets lost at times is the broader reality of like running a coalition campaign. So we don't if it was up to me, Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Hillary Clinton would both like live in exile. Okay. Like I don't, I have no appreciation for these particular figures, but they actually do have popularity. Certainly Hillary Clinton does. And for whatever reason, Debbie Wasserman Schultz keeps getting reelected to Congress. And I don't think it's because of like secret ballot machines. They are part of like a broad base and coalition that you're going to need to activate to win a large race at some point, right? And I think this is where like a little bit of a global perspective helps. Like this exists everywhere. AMLO, the new president of Mexico, he's good. It's a real step in the right direction. One of the core parts of his coalition that elected him are evangelicals who have like Stone Age social views, but are overlapping on issues of poverty, right? Like this is just part of politics. And I think sometimes people will take like, a thing like a tweet and take it way too seriously. Like I told people months ago, I said, get ready for Andrew Gillum to posture in disgusting ways about Latin America. Now, I think the distinction is if Andrew Gillum came out and said we need to invade Venezuela, well, that's a completely different conversation, right? That's substantive, and we need to oppose that wherever it is. But we need to be a little bit more willing to just look at the Machiavellian parts of politics and be real about it, right? So that's a more kind of narrow point. More broadly, I think the reason it's tripping people up is especially when people on our side kind of talk about Gillum or other candidates who could have doubled down on these issues, because let's like face facts here. It's like 2 years after Clinton, there's a couple of, there's a lot of information coming in, right? Like a lot of the polling and data on Trump voters, which shouldn't be surprising because they're basically Republican base voters, is that they are actually driven by cultural prejudices, right? And we look at like Georgia, where Stacey Abrams definitely lost that race because of voter disenfranchisement. At the very least, her pool of votes she could have gotten exceeded the margins she lost by, right? And she probably would have gotten those votes. Andrew Gillum's opponent is an objectively racist. Like he is one of those borderline Klan guys. And so it doesn't mean, and I'll get quickly to my final point in a second, it doesn't mean for a second that we don't run on those aggressive left policies, because those are in everybody's best interest, and they are the best chance we have of getting what few independents and non-voting people there are. And by the way, they're best for most people who aren't oligarchs anyways, right? But I think that when we aren't real and honest about the level of prejudice that does drive right-wing politics, it starts to tarnish our brand with people that are actually on our team. And so that's important to me. And then secondly, I think it's also important, like, to say we're not talking about quote unquote, like, this isn't Twitter woke culture to say that Stacey, like, democracy not functioning in Georgia is not, here are the top 10 reasons why Seinfeld is problematic. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are serious issues, as Bill Fletcher Jr. says, of identity, of democracy, not identity. And the final point I make is, I mean, I agree with you. I think we just need to position things like single payer, ending the drug war, in the right way, in the way that isn't alienating or mitigates racism. Because, by the way, the pseudo-woke neoliberal centrists are going to try to smear us with that brand anyways. So let's not play into their arms.
Okay, so there's a lot to respond to there.
Yeah,
I agree with most. I agree with most of what you said. So first, let's just get some facts out of the way. Total and utter agreement about, for example, Georgia, how that was stolen. I mean, there's no other interpretation of it. And I was one of, the new media voices. Unfortunately, one of the few voices in, the broader media throughout the country that covered this issue and kind of harped away on it and said, this is insane.
You did great on that, for sure. Thanks, man, for sure.
No, of course. I mean, when it crossed my radar, I was like, oh, well, this is insane. I mean, a guy overseeing his own election, literally purging about 350,000 people from the rolls, according to Greg Pallas, who did some great investigative reporting over there. And many of the people that were purged were signed up by the New Georgia Project, which was Stacey Abrams' thing. So it was intentional, it was purposeful, and it's shameful that the media didn't pick up on that more and talk about it as the outrage that it is. And it's also a shame that this isn't hammered away on by the Democrats in a way that makes it so that, like, because you know how Republicans always hammer voter fraud, and of course that's a nonsense issue.
Right.
But the left should be hammering away on basically the stolen election and what happened in Georgia, and it's a shame that they didn't. So that total agreement on that. Now, to the point about the bigotry on the right and that this is driving far-right politics, particularly Trumpism, I don't disagree with that, but I think there's a little bit of people are talking over each other's heads on this issue. It's a little bit of a red herring question, and you've seen this with Mehdi Hasan and Breonna Gray going back and forth on this. Mm-hmm. And I think the point is, on the empirical substantive question, we have total agreement as to what's driving the right. The real issue in my mind is it was only about 70,000 votes in the Rust Belt that really gave the election to Trump over Hillary, even as bad as Hillary Clinton is. So what that means is the real conversation is, how do we chip away enough to actually win these elections? And my answer to that is basically, to bring it full circle back to the Gillum conversation, is I'm trying to get through to everybody to let them know that this old politics has to die. This conventional wisdom, Washington, D.C. bubble politics has to die. And you know the conventional wisdom just as well as I do. The idea is, okay, in the primary, sure, you posture left and you say, hey, aren't I so far left? Don't you guys love me, Democratic base? And then if you're a serious person in the general election, obviously what you have to do is you have to pivot right, and you have to reach across the aisle, and you have to find these phantom moderates. And if Justice Democrats proved anything, and if Our Revolution and all these other new groups proved anything, it's that conventional wisdom is just flat out factually wrong. And it's very likely that those 70,000 votes in the Rust Belt that turned the election over to Donald Trump, it's very likely that if you had even a slightly more populist, leftist candidate than Hillary Clinton, that Donald Trump would not be president. So we have full agreement on the actual bigotry that's driving the far right. But to harp away on that, ultimately, I think, doesn't really achieve anything other than just, shaming people for being bad people. But the real question is, how do we get those 70,000 people in the Rust Belt who are not the too far gones, who are the people who've been screwed over by these trade deals that basically destroyed their lives in their little factory towns? And I think that that's the heart of the agreement, of the disagreement, is where do we put the onus in the conversation, and how do we actually win? And, as a co-founder of Justice Democrats, I have nothing but joy at what's happened since we've created the group. Because when you look at Justice Democrats and Our Revolution and PCCC and Democratic Socialists of America and all these groups that are working hard on the left to get people elected, we're blowing up the old model that's used. So 41% of these of candidates endorsed by these left-wing groups ended up winning their primaries. And now we actually have 13 members from these groups that are now in Washington, D.C. So that means in one election cycle, we did more than the Green Party was able to do. They have nobody in Washington, D.C.
Right, of
we
course.
did more than independents. We did more than everybody else. And we did that also with a giant monetary disadvantage, only running candidates on small dollar donations. So what that should tell people is this isn't just like, a vanity project, and we're not just hardcore ideologues. What we're talking about here is just ruthless, pragmatic, practical, how do we win elections? And it just so turns out that the way to win elections is also the same thing that would give us actual policy victories for the American people. If you just sell this leftist vision, it's a lot more popular than people thought. We don't have to, hide in the closet with our leftism anymore. We could let that flag fly, and that's actually that would produce nothing but wins across the board.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I agree with probably over 90% of what you're saying. And let me just, I think to sort of disaggregate. So I think starting with your main point, I think we're really lucky in the sense that where this populist fake scam, fake populism that Donald Trump was running was most salient was probably right. It was about 70 to 100,000 people in the Rust Belt. And even more broadly than that, I think, we've talked about the Malaika Jabali piece. I think you saw my interview with her.
Loved it.
Right. She talked about it from the perspective of lack of African-American turnout in Wisconsin, centered around a lot of the same issues: deindustrialization, inequality, all of the, atrocious policies pursued by the Democratic consensus that open the way to this far-right authoritarian current that we see globally. So that's totally true. Now, the only thing that I want to sort of complicate is just two things, right? So one is Florida is a very different state and a very different electoral dynamic than the Rust Belt. And it might be that in Florida that the sort of same logic of who those potential swing voters or pickoff votes are very different than they are in the industrial Midwest. I think the industrial Midwest is by far the closest to what you and I would advocate in terms of like just turn those pro-labor, pro-income inequality addressing serious universal programs as the answer. Whereas in a place like Florida, the truth of the matter is that, look, yeah, Andrew Gillum, he wasn't as robust on single payer, but he was actually still really aggressive on Medicaid expansion, which would make a difference for millions of people, including a lot of Republicans. And it was also such a small margin where he clearly got out the people that he needed to get out to win that race. And there was also a disparity between how people said they would vote and how they'd actually vote, kind of indicating that there were some white voters that would sort of say they'd vote for a black candidate but didn't. And if we looked at so many of the reporting out of Florida and so much of, even like white voters saying in interviews like, oh, I didn't vote for Gillum because I just think having a black governor is divisive, right? Like just on their face, racist reasoning. And I think it's important for us to be real, not to shame and condemn people, but to just be honest and rigorous and supportive of our own comrades and allies when we actually face a race like that, where the real breaking point was the racism, right? And I think the third point that I just want to say quick that's interesting to me is there's no doubt there's a Democratic playbook of corporate elite, neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, Democrats. And it used to be until very, very recently, and it still is the case in some ways. Hillary Clinton, you could see she's already pivoting with her immigration comments. It wasn't just pretending to be more economically left in primaries. It was pretending in primaries to care about things like civil rights. And then in a general election, or even in a primary, if you're Bill Clinton, signing a death warrant for a mentally disabled black man, or if you're Hillary Clinton calling, we all know the super predators comment, or, more structurally advocating criminal justice policies that are bad for everyone, but definitely are racialized and disproportionately hit people of color. And the way to me this shows up is like Beto O'Rourke, okay? That's not my candidate. I like him in some ways. I'm, of course, prefer him over Cruz, but he runs against Bernie. Fuck out of here. Bernie, every single day, every day of the year, of course. But one of the things that made him stand out as a candidate was that he actually chose, as an example, when, the Dallas police officer went into the black man's home and murdered him, to say that's not good. While Ted Cruz was like, we never blame a cop for anything, even going into a home and murdering somebody. So I think more broadly with the coalition that we need to build, and again, it's not necessarily even about shaming specific voters. I'm not saying go to the Rust Belt and tell people who have lost their jobs and dealing with opioid addiction about like their male privilege or something. I'm not talking about like some type of like BuzzFeed listicle politics, but civil rights and justice and equality for all is core to our mission. It's core to building an alliance to win. And it also, I think it actually cut through some of the noise for the same reason that the economic stuff does, because some of it is just people responding to political courage.
Yeah. So again, many, many areas of disagreement and a bunch of stuff I could get into off that. So first of all, I just want to state for the record, if anybody thinks otherwise about, my personal brand of my particular brand of leftism here, I would never say that social issues don't matter. I think they matter massively. And I think that we also have the polling overwhelmingly on our side for most of those issues as well. So would I advocate for people to run on criminal justice reform and ending the drug war and legalizing marijuana and a variety of other issues that are tied directly into, fundamentally a racist crackdown on communities of color? Absolutely, I would advocate doing that. So I just want to, because I feel like sometimes people have this perception that for whatever reason, if you care a lot about economic issues, that somehow by definition you have to have a blind spot on the social issues. And no, I think those issues matter massively as well. And also, I think that there's an important point that needs to be made that economic issues are also racial issues.
Right.
Exactly. And that's a point that I think is really important. And just to go back to Gillum for a second, I don't want to beat up on the guy too much. I mean, I think he deserves massive credit because the fact of the matter is he ran further left than anybody running for governor in Florida, maybe ever. And he also lost by the tiniest amount.
Right.
So I actually think he's further evidence of, the philosophy that I'm talking about, why it's correct. And whether or not he actually would have gotten over the finish line when push came to shove, if I was running his campaign and I was giving him the advice of, no, listen, man, you're going to sound exactly like you did in the primary. We're going to do more events with Bernie. You're not going to do events with Hillary Clinton. She has a 36% approval rating, and you might think it's a good idea, but it's not a good idea. Would he have won? We'll never know. And people might say I'm a terrible dude for even speculating and saying I think he would possibly have pulled it off. But to me, and this is perhaps what I think is maybe the most important piece of evidence for what I'm arguing for. When you look around the country, and this is including Florida in this last election, wherever we had direct ballot initiatives, the left-wing position wins over 80% of the time. And the only times where we lose, it's only because there's a gigantic fundraising effort on the other side, whether it be by billionaires or corporations or whomever. So, and in Florida, there was, I think it was a direct ballot initiative about getting ex-felons their voting rights back. And if I'm not mistaken, it was with over 60% of the vote
It was
that
definitely
passed.
with over 60% of the vote. And I think it's also important to remember that, it's Florida and white Republicans have felon relatives in Florida.
No,
You know what
of
I'm
course.
saying?
But, I hear you,
no
100%.
doubt. Yeah.
But also, whenever you put minimum wage increases on the ballot and legalizing marijuana, the overwhelming majority of the time,
Hugely
these pass.
popular. Can I just say, I'm not trying to interrupt, but I just want to say
No,
something.
no, go ahead. I was done anyway.
So
Go
just
ahead.
this slightly so I agree with you. And I think that in some ways I think that we're having a debate about strategy and alliance building because there's no daylight on these issues. And I would probably even add some even more. Like, I want to nationalize the oil industry. Like,
That would be awesome.
100% with it. No doubt. We need to. But I think, so let me say as an example, I have a friend who, Luke Mayville, who's an amazing dude who he spearheaded. He's the reason Idaho did Medicaid expansion. He started building that campaign over a year ago. It went from like a small thing. He would fly from New York back to his hometown, Idaho, every other month. And by the end, I was there a couple of weeks ago in Boise, and there's like a campaign office, the Medicaid expansion van. It was this incredible campaign he built. And we went out. I did some canvassing with him, which was awesome. Everybody should go canvass, go door to door. And there was one, like, I have to say, actually, incredibly charming, tough old lady that we talked to for a while who was awesome. And we were definitely not there to get into a debate with her. And, she was an enthusiastic voter for Medicaid expansion. And she also was definitely a too far gone in your book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, I'll do this, but you need to make sure that the Mexicans don't get it, and all of this shit. And my point being is that there's plenty of voters out there, like even the most regressive people, unless they're completely in like the fucking bottom well of Dave Rubin video algorithm. They're not
Cato Institute subscriber.
Yeah, exactly. Like, most people are smart enough to recognize I'm not a multimillionaire. I want a higher minimum wage. I want to expand Medicaid. But when you package it out, those people will still go and vote their racial prejudices or elsewhere when it comes to a total election package. And I just want to tag two things onto this because one, and this will be the last thing I say, actually, I just want you to respond to it because I'm really interested in your perspective. So one part that I keep emphasizing is I think it's incredibly important, and also because, as you said, these issues are all interconnected. There are issues that are of racial and structural gender issues that are connected to economics, but not only economics. These things have innate importance, and also, just not to mention the fact, strip any ethics away, there's no center left to left coalition that's ever going to win that doesn't build a truly democratic, truly multiracial coalition. It's impossible. It can't be done without it. And I know you know that and agree with that. And the second point I'd say, there was a piece of polling research that happened in the 80s where Stan Greenberg talked to Reagan Democrats, right? Like some of the prototypical sort of Trump-style voters. And what these people was they were absolutely super racist. And what they said was, we get that Republicans only care about big companies and screw us, but we don't trust the Democrats to go after companies either because we think they're compromised by the corporate money too, which is totally true. And then on the other hand, we think that Republicans will be assholes and SOBs to black people, essentially. And so we want that to happen, so we'll vote for them. And I think the answer for us is somewhere in the middle of aggressively work to destroy racism politically and ethically, because that's our task, both strategically and morally, and then also prove to people in the long run that no, we really aren't going to screw you over in favor of corporations. Republicans are oligarchs, we aren't, and fuck them. And if you can get on board with that, then welcome aboard. But if you can't, if the bigotry is more important, then you're just not part of the team.
Yeah. So I get my answer to that, or my response to that, is actually more of a question.
Yeah.
First of all, this is I really don't know the answer to this, but how do we change those people's minds?
I think those people's minds are not going to be changed. I think that's where it's a decades-long project. Like, see, because in some ways, I think this argument is too shrunk in terms of a time frame, right? Like, it's like on one hand, it's like, okay, what explains Trump? Well, America's is in fact a racist country to its founding. That's reality. Then on the other hand, if there weren't decades of neoliberal policies, I don't think you get Trump. And then on the other hand, in this really condensed time frame, I think there were some people that were like, whoa, a black guy and now a woman? Fuck that. So it's super complicated and overdetermined. My instinct would be that in the long run, these types of policies that you and I both advocate for will help reduce that. But I also think, and this is where just being a good salesman and having good politicians and good communicators, I think that it's been proven historically on the other side of American history where there have been these incredible multiracial alliances going back to fucking Reconstruction. If you get people who are good leaders and honest and robust and appeal to people's, better nature, progress is actually made. And it's somewhere in the middle of synthesis of those two things. Like, we're better for you because we'll deliver you shit. And also, come on, dude, be better. You know what I'm saying?
I totally agree with that. But my other question is, as of right now, how big do you think this community of TFGs is?
I think it's the Republican. I think it's over 90% of people who voted for Trump. And then I agree with you. It's really small, but it's super geographically importantly located across the industrial Midwest. And we could totally get them back with a serious national health care plan.
So I think now we've gotten to the core of the minor disagreement that we have, because I think that, and I don't have polling to back this up. I'd have to go through polling, and I could definitely be swayed off of what I'm about to say if you present enough empirical data to show me. But
right.
I have a hunch it's more like half of the Republican Party is TFG. And so maybe we're talking 25, maybe 30% of the entire country is TFG. And then I think the rest of them are, you can kind of get with the bread and butter of what we're talking about here in terms of policy.
Well, I think either way, I think no matter however large that margin is, in some ways is secondary, because I think the only point of area where there could be a serious disagreement, which I don't think we have, I'm sure we don't have. If some person came along and said, don't talk about the police killing black people, as an example.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Because that will alienate somebody that I've made up in my mind that lives in West Virginia. Then you and I both totally reject that.
Not only do I reject that, I would berate whoever would say that.
Exactly.
Because that stuff matters. Somebody being murdered matters. Social issues are very important.
Exactly. Because it's about democracy and bigger than it's about democracy and rights.
And it's about principle.
And about principle.
We have a principled stance against murder.
Exactly. And against racism. And I think,
of course, yes.
So then
absolutely.
I think then it's awesome, because you and I agree that the same experiment needs to be run because even if it had got no new votes, we're right about the issues. We know what actually needs to fucking happen here.
Right.
Yeah. And I also think the last thing I'll say is I also just think part of the reason that I'm kind of pushing this and trying to advocate talking about it in a really effective way, hopefully, is I know that this is all they've got as far as Democratic primary opposition. It's going to all be, you guys are crypto this and you don't understand that. And I want us to come out of the gate and be like, no, we're actually more serious about those issues than you are, because we're the real progressives. We're the real sort of holders of the flame, and you're just doing bullshit manipulation and actually taking really serious issues and reducing it to a bullshit tactic. And we win.
Yeah, so what are we going to do? Because I'm already seeing that in terms of 2020. There is a weaponization of identity politics used against the Bernie Sanders wing.
Definitely.
And, and it's hilariously ironic because, again, as a co-founder of Justice Democrats, we've had amazing success already, and we have 7 Justice Democrats in Washington, D.C., and all the ones that got elected in this last election just happened to be women of color.
Right.
So this argument of you're a bunch of Bernie bros and you don't care about like somehow you're racist and sexist because you support Bernie Sanders, and they're going to cynically weaponize this.
100%.
And I don't know how to combat it other than just to mock it and not be nice about it.
Well, I think that's part of it. And I mean, you've seen me enough to know that I'm very capable of mocking and not being nice. But I think that for people, because I actually though think like actually using the same principle that we're applying to appealing to those Rust Belt voters, I think that there's a ton of voters that are actually way closer to us and more important to us for building a winning Democratic coalition. And all they need to know is that people like us are serious about it, actually have, policies, plans, ideas, we're connected to it. And then we can, by our actions and the whole way we brand and do everything, debunk that bullshit and actually go on the offensive. Because, yeah, I want to know, going back to someone like Hillary Clinton, I would do this all the time in 2016. Like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I've been talking about the death penalty, prisons, policing, and also, by the way, how all of these issues, including when you say, oh, breaking up the banks won't fix racism. Well, yeah, but it might actually make a huge dent on redlining and discrimination in home loans. So
Boom.
Give me the ball. I'll go on the offense. And we cannot play into their hands.
That's a great point. In fact, I think without even trying, you swayed me off of the more mocking approach, because you're right. As long as you're there on the policy, which is the main thing, then I think you're gonna have victories in the long run, and you're gonna convince more people.
100%. Kyle Kulinski, this is awesome. I think we should definitely have more conversations and dialogues. Everybody, if you haven't yet, of course, this is going to be on both of our channels. But if for whatever reason you're more from like maybe the podcast audience, you're new to Kyle. I know Kyle is a king of YouTube, but if you haven't yet, check him out at Secular Talk. It's great stuff. Kyle, really appreciate it, man.
Thanks, man. And for everybody on my channel, check out Michael's show too. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Take care, buddy. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye. All right, folks. We'll be back here at around 7:10.